Dr. Skinner-Dorkenoo has been an assistant professor at the University of Georgia since the fall of 2019. She's director of the Georgia Attitude, Bias, and Behavior Acquisition, or GABA, lab that examines how systemic forms of oppression are maintained and reinforced through subtle patterns of thought and behavior, and how those systems can be challenged. So let's turn it over to you, and you can begin your presentation.
All right, great. Thank you for having me. And let's make sure I can do this share thing again. Okay, that's the first half. Okay. All right. So thank you so much for having me. The talk that I am going to be giving to you today is The Water That We Swim In. And I am hoping that, I guess, ask me questions. You can feel free to jump in if there's a quick clarification question. Also, there's a number of things I'm going to sort of like go over quickly, but I'm more than happy to talk about them, give more details if there's questions at the end as well. So let's jump in. So I'm going to start my talk today with a little thought exercise. I want you to take a look at this photo and think about the different things that you see. So noticing the different textures and shapes and colors. So I want you to sort of think about what you see in this photo. Now, what you might have noticed is some of the different types of fish and their colors, or maybe the colors and the textures of the coral reef. But what you probably didn't spend much time thinking about was the water that was all around these things that they're surrounded by. And much like the sea in this example, I study how our social attitudes and beliefs are shaped by often overlooked features of our social environments, and how these attitudes and beliefs ultimately serve to perpetuate and reinforce systems of oppression. So consider the following scenario. Imagine arriving at a station to wait for a train, and you look around and notice that others seem to be distancing themselves from one specific person. And the message that's suggested by their nonverbal behavior is that there's something wrong with this person, but they appear fairly average, and you're unable to come up with any kind of explanation for this apparent avoidance. But even so, others' nonverbal signals may lead you to feel a little uneasy around this person. And indeed, there is quite a bit of evidence that nonverbal signals do influence attitudes. So infants will avoid unfamiliar individuals after observing a parent display negative nonverbal signals toward that person. Infants will also avoid objects after seeing someone display negative nonverbal signals toward that object. Nonverbal signals can also prime cultural biases, increasing racial biases among children and adults. But what I really wanted to know was whether social biases toward individual and groups could readily be acquired through exposure to biased nonverbal signals. And so to test whether social attitudes could be acquired through nonverbal signals, I began with children. And so what I did here was I had preschool children observe a videotaped interaction in which an adult expressor, so I'm referring to the person in the middle as the expressor who's showing expressions, demonstrated nonverbal behavior favoring one target over another. So one of these individuals over another. And I predicted that after this exposure, the 4- and 5-year-old children in my study would show a bias against the target of negative nonverbal signals relative to the target of positive nonverbal signals. So here, I'm going to show you an example video of nonverbal bias. And so I'll just go ahead and show you that first.
Hi. 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 Look what I have. This one's for you. This one's for you.
So after watching this video, then I asked children to answer a series of questions designed to sort of get at how they felt about these people. So they answered questions about who they liked best, who they wanted to give a toy to, who they trusted to know the name for an unfamiliar object. So we asked them a number of different questions. Also, I just wanted to clarify, this is an example of one of the videos, but we had a number of different versions so that we could sort of rule out the possibility that other extraneous things like what side of the screen the people were on and different other sort of things about which person was preferred and so on were not influencing kids' attitudes or were not like what we were picking up on in this study. So here I'm going to show you the results of this study. And what I'm showing here is probabilities. So what you're going to see is that anything over the line at 0.5 means they're favoring the person who received more positive nonverbal signals. And what I'm showing you is the first experiment that I just explained to you. And then there were actually 3 subsequent experiments where we tried to just make sure that this was really true by testing it over and over again. And so what you can see is that across all the studies, we're seeing that greater than that sort of cutoff point. So basically it's a probability greater than chance that they are favoring, that the children are favoring the person who received the more positive nonverbal signals. So these findings establish that nonverbal signals can create social attitudes among preschoolers. So we have this initial set of studies where we tested this with preschoolers. Then, let's see. Slides are not moving. Okay. So I also conducted a parallel series of studies with adults. And this was to see whether adults would also acquire attitudes in this way. I showed adults a different video because we figured a more adult oriented video would be better. So I'm going to show you that video in just a moment, but we were looking at the same general premise. We were trying to see, would adults also favor the person who received more positive nonverbal signals if we expose them to a video that showed these kind of nonverbal biases? And this graph is a tiny bit different, but the premise here is that higher values mean more bias that's consistent with what they observed in the video. In this case, if it's above 0, there is a bias in that direction. And as you can see here, adults showed evidence of bias acquisition from nonverbal signals. And so overall, these first few set of studies with children and adults, they're an informative first step for this work. But if biases are embedded within a culture, there will likely be a systemic pattern of who tends to receive more positive nonverbal signals in society. So it won't just be arbitrary. Certain people will tend to receive more positive nonverbal signals than others. And so exposure to nonverbal bias could potentially have much wider repercussions, serving as a means through which systemic cultural biases are transmitted. So, as briefly noted earlier, prior work on nonverbal signals shows that people's attitudes toward individuals from familiar social groups, such as people of different races, can be influenced by valence nonverbal signals, so by positive or negative nonverbal signals. And in this prior work, samples of predominantly white participants who observed negative nonverbal signals displayed by a white person toward a Black person. So as you're seeing in this clip or in this photo. So people who observed a video in which more negative nonverbal signals were being displayed by a white person toward a Black person, those people went on to have more negative attitudes toward that specific Black person, but also increased anti-Black bias in general, relative to those who observed positive nonverbal signals directed toward a Black person. So building upon this prior work, I wanted to examine whether novel prejudices can also spread in this way, such that people will actually acquire generalized group prejudices through exposure to nonverbal signals. So I'm going to tell you a little bit more about what I mean by that. But to do this, participants were exposed to a series of silent video clips in which positive nonverbal signals were directed toward one target individual and negative nonverbal signals were directed toward another target individual. And participants were informed that the targets were members of larger national groups, Osnovia and Algova. Now, those are not actually real countries. We created fictitious countries for the purpose of this study because we wanted to make sure that we were not capturing any pre-existing attitudes. So we wanted to make sure that we were not getting at attitudes that people might already have toward these countries or knowledge that they might already have of particular countries. So in order to do that, to make sure we had a totally clean slate at the beginning, we needed to create totally fictitious countries so that participants couldn't have any pre-existing knowledge or attitudes. And then when we presented participants with the videos, which I'm going to show you in just a moment, they were informed that the targets were members of, there was buttons on their clothing, as you can see right here. So we sort of digitally added them with the computer to their clothing to signify their national group membership. And we told participants that was just to help them track, what country each person was from. So now I'm going to finally show you a brief selection of the videos. This is just to give you an idea of what the nonverbal bias manipulation videos look like. This is just like a super brief clip, but the people in the study watched much longer versions and they saw multiple different people, not this one specific, more than just this one specific woman showing the nonverbal signals. So as you can see in, there we go. In the negative video clip, you can see that the facial expressions and the body language of the expressor seem negative and suggest that she's displeased with the person from Osnovia. Whereas in the positive video clip, you can see that she's smiling and she's demonstrating warm nonverbal signals toward the person from Algova. All right, and so now looking at what did our results look like? Did people acquire attitudes toward those nationalities, toward Osnovia and Algova, based on watching these videos? And what we found was that they did. And so overall, we saw a tendency above zero. So in this case, above zero means a bias that is consistent with what they saw in the video. Now, I also tested this with kids. So in a related set of studies, I looked at whether kids would essentially sort of show this same sort of pattern. We looked at this in two different ways. If we, just said the red shirt people and the black shirt people, and then we also did it in terms of where the people were from. So whether they were from Black Pine or from Red Veil. So there's two sort of different ways that we explained the groups for kids, but we were looking at the same general thing, seeing if they watched that video I showed you before, would they generalize their attitudes toward those individual targets to the broader members of the group, or to the broader groups, I should say. And so similar to the previous preschool studies that I described, I asked children, now in this case, instead of asking them about the individuals, I asked them which group the children preferred, which group they would prefer to interact with, which group they thought knew the names and uses of unfamiliar objects. So trying to get at a number of different aspects of sort of liking and trusting. And here again, the main important thing with this graph is if it's greater than that 0.5 point. And as we see in both cases, whether they were referred to as the red shirts versus black shirts or people from Red Veil and Black Pine, overall, we're still seeing that kids sort of generalized their attitudes and favored the entire group of the person who received more positive nonverbal signals. So overall, this showed that children do develop nonverbal signal consistent group prejudices. Now, sort of taking everything I've told you together so far, my work shows the potential impact of nonverbal signals in creating and shaping attitudes toward other people in society. And in Isabel Wilkerson's book, Caste, she makes the case that nonverbal behavior not only conveys important messages about social hierarchy, but also serves to uphold systems of oppression. So to the extent that people adopt these subtle behavioral signs of bias, taking on the nonverbal behavioral biases that they're exposed to, that could be really important. So in order to examine this, I went back to the videos of the kids participating in the studies. So with all of those, the previous kid studies that I did, most of them, they came into the research lab, and we actually have a video of them participating in the study to try and make sure that we got all their answers and everything down correctly. But what that meant is that we could go back and we could look at these videos and we could see if, while they were watching the video, were they mimicking what was going on? Were they showing this sort of behavioral evidence of sort of catching those nonverbal signals and displaying them themselves? And so I'm going to show you a video to give you sort of a better sense of what that looked like.
Hi. Look what I have. This one's for you. This one's for you.
So I'm not sure how clear that video showed up for you all, but this little girl was sort of mimicking her facial expressions along with what she was seeing in the video, showing positive expressions when positive expressions were being shown in the video, and negative expressions when negative expressions were being shown in the video. So we had people go through and watch all of these old videos and make a note. So they were sort of coding whether kids were matching the emotional responses that they were observing in the video or not. And so when we looked at the overall sample, we had almost 300 videos from these prior studies. And what we saw was that 40% of the kids showed at least some mimicry of the biased nonverbal signals that they observed. And although mimicry occurred less often for the negative nonverbal signals, children who adopted these behavioral demonstrations of negative emotion were substantially more likely to show the nonverbal signal consistent attitudes. So with this, we observed this link between we observed this initial evidence of a behavioral spread of bias. So kids were observing these nonverbal biases and then mimicking them themselves, but also some suggestive evidence that this is linked with attitude contagion, such that the kids who were mimicking more negative nonverbal signals were also showing more strong adoption of the attitudes that they observed. So to sort of sum up this section on nonverbal signals, sort of much like the water in the sea, nonverbal signals are all around us, but they might often blend into the background. My work highlights the important role that they can play in shaping our understanding of the world around us and sustaining systems of oppression. Now, in the next section, I'm going to move on to discuss another subtle means through which systemic biases and oppression are upheld, which is microaggressions. So just to get us started, I'm going to sort of give some definitions and basic stuff to make sure we're all on the same page. So racial microaggressions can be described as subtle, everyday slights committed against people of color due to their racial group membership. And historically, they have been discussed in terms of how they impact those who experience them, which is very important. But in a recent paper that I published with my students, we argued that it's also important to consider how microaggressions play a role in larger systemic, perpetuating larger systemic issues. So helping to propagate and maintain a societal system in which white people are afforded greater status, power, and privilege than people of color. So in this next section, I'm going to be providing some illustrative examples to support this argument, but also highlighting some of my own empirical work that contributes to our theorizing. And because of the societal specificity of these microaggressions, I just wanted to mention that this section is largely sort of situated in the context of the US, but I also think that similar systems can also be seen in many other cultures around the world. So the sort of basics of our argument is that microaggressions establish white superiority in the US in sort of a two-step process. So the first is by othering people of color and reinforcing this notion that people of color are fundamentally different from white people. So there's sort of this division. And then the second is to indicate that white people as that distinct group are a superior group of people. So I'm going to go through explaining the ways in which we sort of argue that that takes place, or at least a few examples. So the notion that white people, the notion of white people as the ideal US citizen can be traced back to the origins of this nation. So for instance, the Naturalization Act of 1790 limited US citizenship to white people. And so although Native Americans inhabited this land long before white people did, and many other people of color have been here for hundreds of years, the notion that people of color must originate from somewhere else, as illustrated in this little hypothetical interaction, persists. And we argue, excuse me, we argue that the continued reinforcement of the societal message that people of color are not true citizens of the US could have broader systemic impacts. So for instance, if people of color are not seen as true citizens, then when the size of racial minority groups or the power afforded to them increases, that could lead white US residents to feel like they're losing their country. So consistent with the notion that changes of this kind are threatening, we found that having white US residents read about the racial significance of Barack Obama's election to the presidency increased pro-white bias among white participants in the US. And then our research, as well as the research of several others, has shown that reading about people of color no longer making up the minority of the US population can also lead to similar increased levels of pro-white bias. And the impact of this message can also be seen in US policies. So an important example of this is that during World War II, over 100,000 people of Japanese descent were imprisoned in concentration camps in the US. Whereas in contrast, US residents of German descent were not separated from the general population and therefore did not have to lose their homes, businesses, and livelihoods. Thus, the perpetuation of this microaggression reinforces the notion that white people are different from people of color and that being white is superior, such that to truly be American is to be white. The next one I wanted to talk about is second-class citizenship. So this second-class citizen microaggression has to do with the tendency to prioritize the needs and desires of white people over people of color. So an example of this might be if a clerk came out from the back of a store to see multiple customers waiting, there might be a tendency to acknowledge the white customers first. Beyond the negative impact on individual people of color who might be marginalized by this experience, the societal pattern of repeatedly prioritizing white people perpetuates a societal message that white people are more important than people of color. So when my students and I started hearing news reports publicizing racial disparities in COVID-19, we were concerned about what impact that might have. We worried that if COVID-19 were seen to be associated with people of color, that could actually end up decreasing public concern about the virus. And so to test this, we first conducted a correlational study where we looked at the extent to which white US residents were aware of COVID-19 racial disparities. And we found that after statistically accounting for knowledge of systemic contributors to racial disparities, those who were sorry, I'm having trouble advancing my slide. There we go. Those who were more aware of COVID-19 racial disparities were less fearful of COVID-19, which ultimately predicted reduced support for COVID-19 safety precautions. So things like masking and social distancing. Next, we experimentally manipulated. So we wanted to see what is the impact of exposing people to this information. So if we tell people and not just look at what they already know, but we tell them information about COVID-19 racial disparities. And here what we found is that having white US residents read about COVID-19 racial disparities not only reduced fear of COVID-19, but it also reduced empathy for those most vulnerable to COVID-19. And both of these were associated with reduced support for COVID-19 safety precautions. So overall, these findings suggest that because of systemic biases prioritizing white people, publicizing racial health disparities could actually create this vicious cycle wherein raising awareness actually reduces support for the very policies that can protect public health and reduce disparities. Okay. So now shifting gears a little bit, I wanted to touch on one more here before I move on to the next section. So according to historian Ibram Kendi, criminal stereotypes of Black people in the US can be traced back to their arrival on North American shores in 1619. And enslaved people who resisted slavery were technically breaking the law. Those who rebelled were painted as violent criminals. Even after the abolition of slavery, criminal stereotypes were used to oppress and exercise violent control over Black people. The criminal assumptions microaggression continues to perpetuate this historical pattern by justifying heightened suspicion and criminal stereotyping that is often directed toward people of color and especially Black people and Black men. So beyond the adverse impact of this experience on Black people, the perpetual reinforcement of societal associations between people of color and crime can dampen support for public policy, for policy change, reifying systemic inequalities. And I'm going to say a little bit more about that. With a study that we conducted shortly after Michael Brown was killed in 2014, I wanted to assess how supportive the US public was of police reform. And what I found was that the more threatened, here we go, people felt by Black men, the less supportive they were of scrutiny of police officers involved in deadly force incidents. Also, the more threatened that they were by Black men, the less supportive they were of matching the demographics of the police force to the communities that they serve. And then finally, the more threatened people reported feeling by Black men, the more circumstances they identified as warranting lethal force. And just to briefly explain this a little bit more, the little list of statements on the left-hand side of the screen, that was the list that we gave people, and essentially they were going through and checking off all of the ones that warranted lethal force. And so essentially we were seeing that they were checking more things off that list, the more threatened that they felt by Black men. So overall, I argue that criminal assumptions serve to reinforce policies that uphold systemic racial oppression. Now, I also argue that microaggressions serve to maintain systemic racism by protecting white superiority and obscuring racist structures. So there's one more thing I want to talk about here that sort of speaks to this protecting of white superiority. So this microaggression is known as denial of individual racism, and it's defined as refusal to take responsibility for one's own racially biased behavior. This can leave people of color feeling unheard and invalidated when real concerns about racial biases are raised. But beyond this, denial of individual racism can be used to protect individuals and organizations that perpetuate biases, allowing them to continue with the same practices and policies without making any changes. And so I'm going to show you a little bit of data that we have related to this. In a series of studies, we examined how people felt about someone who showed evidence of bias, such as favoring white candidates for a leadership job. And then after that, participants were told that the person had either admitted to having biases and wanted to work on them, or they denied it. And what we found was that the deniers of bias, and we looked at this over a number of different studies, and we consistently found that the deniers of bias were perceived to be less prejudiced and even considered to be better people than the person who admitted that they had biases and that they were working on them. Thus, denying bias seems to allow individuals to continue with the same biased behavior, but maintain their reputation. Now, I also wanted to mention how we can see this working at an institutional level. So organizations that are accused of bias often implement diversity trainings and initiatives, which serve as evidence that they are not biased and protect companies from being sued for discrimination. There is pretty limited evidence that brief corporate diversity trainings do much to change the attitudes and culture of organizations, but they do serve the very important purpose of establishing denial that the organization could be racist, protecting them from claims of discrimination. And then sort of to conclude this little section, I wanted to bring up this quote from Ibram Kendi, because he's argued that denial is key to the persistence of systemic racism in the US. He argues that there is a regular structural denial that racial inequality is caused by racist policy. And whenever an American engages in a racist act and someone points it out, the inevitable response to the sound of that denial is, I'm not racist. It can't be, I was being racist, but I'm going to try to be anti-racist. It's always, I'm not racist. It's no wonder that the racist acts never stop. So taken together, I argue that microaggressions, which are often subtle and may blend into the background for many of us, especially those of us who are privileged, function as a means of perpetuating systemic racism. And beyond this, they also serve to protect the system by deflecting threats and obscuring racist structures. So the work that I've presented thus far speaks to the subtle means through which systemic biases are spread and how these attitudes and systemic forms of oppression are maintained and protected. In this last section of my talk, I wanted to mention some of my most recent work in which I've begun to examine how the systems and patterns that I've highlighted this far can be challenged and interrupted. So having established that group prejudices can be acquired from biased nonverbal signals, I began looking into ways that the effects of nonverbal signals could possibly be lessened. So in other words, are there things that we could say or do that would stop people from becoming prejudiced after being exposed to biased nonverbal signals? So one thing that I was thinking about is that people tend to be somewhat unaware of the nonverbal signals that shape their attitudes. So I've seen that in quite a bit of my data. People are not all that aware of the nonverbal signals that they're being surrounded by and also how they're impacting their attitudes. But there is evidence that when people are more aware of their own biases, they tend to be better at reducing them. So there's sort of this correspondence between bias awareness and bias reduction. So I postulated that if we make participants aware of the nonverbal signals that they're exposed to, that could possibly limit prejudice acquisition. So I think if someone wants to add a question in the chat, I can try to answer. I guess it kind of depends on what it is, if it should be like a save for the end question or not. Okay, so let's see. Sorry. Having trouble advancing. Okay, so So I wanted to see if I made people more aware of the nonverbal signals that they're exposed to, what impact might that have? Could that lessen the impact of exposure to nonverbal biases? And so in order to do this in the first study, I told participants that they may notice that people tend to be colder and less friendly toward the targets of negative nonverbal signals, whereas they tend to be fairly warm and friendly toward the targets of positive nonverbal signals. So this was sort of the information that I gave participants before they watched the video. And then they watched the same nonverbal bias video that I showed you a clip from before. And then I had this control condition for the purposes of comparison. So we could sort of see how does that compare to people who got this nonverbal bias awareness message. And so to orient you to this graph, it's set up in the same sort of way that the previous ones I showed you are. And in this one, what I'm going to be showing you, we're looking at values above 0 indicate a bias consistent with the video. And what we have here is that, as you can see in the control condition, so this was the standard condition without any additional information. So those participants showed this small bias that was consistent with the nonverbal messages in the video. So that was what we predicted. The bias awareness condition, we are seeing the opposite of what we predicted. So what we're seeing, that higher value for the bias awareness, that's showing us that actually instead of reducing the bias, it increased the bias when we told people to sort of be on the lookout for these nonverbal signals. So surprisingly, participants in the nonverbal bias awareness condition actually show greater bias than the other participants. So this was not a good strategy. I'm happy to talk more about this if you have questions. I think the next part sort of highlights a little bit of what I think was going on. But since we found that actually seemed to sort of increase the impact of nonverbal signals, I next turned to some other proposed alternatives. And so one idea that I had, which I think ties into those findings, is that maybe we need to frame the context to let people know that the nonverbal signals are unjust. And the reason for this is that there's a tendency for people to see the way things are as the way that they should be, as they're sort of the status quo as being sort of right and just. But if nonverbal biases are framed as being rooted in injustice, so we sort of tell people that it's unjust, that they're being treated in this way, then that could potentially disrupt the tendency to internalize these observed biases. And there is some work that suggests that sort of knowledge of historical injustices can shape the way that we see sort of dynamics within the present. So overall, I thought maybe that would help, and maybe just telling people about, like, notice that people are sort of cold to members of this group, that sort of reinforced it and made it sound even more just. Whereas if we tell them it's unjust, that might be able to challenge that. Another possible approach that I want to mention briefly is just giving positive information about the stigmatized targets. So basically just saying good things about them before we show them the nonverbal bias video. So before they're exposed to that nonverbal bias information. And there is evidence from previous research that this kind of just sort of explicit messages about other individuals and groups can have a powerful impact on the attitudes of adults and children. So we thought maybe just giving positive information about members of this stigmatized group, that could be helpful. So that's what that's the other thing that we tested. So I tested the impact of these alternative bias mitigation strategies. I'm going to briefly just show you how I did that. So in one, I was challenging the tendency to conclude that the way things are is the way they should be by framing the treatment of targets of negative nonverbal signals as sort of a remnant of historical injustice. So this is the, little thing that we told them. So targets of negative nonverbal signals have historically faced a great deal of prejudice and discrimination from others, and that although things have improved, many still feel that they are viewed differently and treated unfairly. Now going on to the setup for the second one. So the positive information, we were really just trying to sort of, so people got one or the other piece of information, not both, just to clarify. And so the people who got this information, we were just really trying to give an overall really positive message that was not specific to any one area. So we're saying that the targets of negative nonverbal signals tend to be nice, friendly people who are generally well liked by others. They have a reputation for being successful, but also generous, kind, and helpful toward others. So we're trying to give sort of generalized overall like positive information about members of this group. And then again, we're comparing that to a control condition where we're not giving any additional information. So we're seeing how do these two information conditions compare to when people just watch the video. Okay, and this is set up in the same way, so I won't explain that overall. Again, what we see for the results, so remember above 0 means bias that is consistent with the video. So in the control condition, we're again seeing the same thing we've been seeing all along, this bias in favor of the non-verbally preferred group in the video. But in the other conditions, we're seeing that sort of flipping. So in the injustice condition, we're not technically seeing any bias at all, but it's sort of on the negative side, suggesting that they're almost trending toward favoring the stigmatized group. And in the positive information condition, you can see that that's clearly well below 0. They're actually favoring the group that received the negative nonverbal signals. And that's because they were given all of that positive explicit information about that group. So essentially that sort of overrode the nonverbal information when we provided all of that positive explicit information about the group. Okay, so this provided some sort of initial evidence. A lot more work needs to be done here to understand how this would work with like real groups. So now I'm going to jump into one last project that I wanted to present to you all that is looking at real groups and an intervention that we tried in my lab. So in 2019, Nicole Hannah-Jones, her issue of the New York Times Magazine, dubbed the 1619 Project, was published, recognizing the 400-year anniversary of the arrival of enslaved people from Africa on the shores of North America. There was a podcast and several books that followed, as well as curriculum designed to incorporate education about the contributions of Black Americans to U.S. society and the impact of slavery on the formation and development of the U.S. Then the following year, on the heels of the racial justice uprisings and protests of 2020, President Trump issued a series of executive orders and proclamations aimed at reining in whether and how we discuss our nation's racial history. And as you can see in this excerpt, he asserted that we need to promote patriotic education and teach children about the miracle of American history. And this was followed by a wave of legislative efforts starting in early 2021, banning what was referred to as critical race theory in educational contexts. The goal being to rein in how and what students are taught about US history. And in fact, many of these bills explicitly reference the 1619 Project, such as the Saving History Act of 2021, which would withhold federal funding from schools that teach the 1619 Project. So why have efforts to more accurately understand US history led to such dramatic backlash? Now, what I argue is that perhaps that's because of a recognition that how we understand the past can really shape how we see the present, including recognition and support for changing racist systems and policies. And indeed, several studies that have been conducted over the last decade have provided support for what is known as the Marley Hypothesis, the notion that knowledge of our past shapes our perceptions of the present. And several studies have shown that knowledge of critical racial history is associated with empathy and awareness of contemporary racism. And disparities in historical knowledge have been argued to help explain why white US residents are more likely to deny contemporary racism than Black US residents. There's also been some initial experimental work indicating that educating people about historical racial injustice can actually increase the tendency to recognize racism at both interpersonal and systemic levels. So building upon this work, my lab conducted a study examining the extent to which learning about historical racial injustices shapes awareness of connections between contemporary policies and the reinforcement of systemic racism. I'm going to give you a little bit more detail on this project than I have on the previous ones, just because I think there's some really important things like nuance to understand here. So in this study, participants they completed pretest measures on a number of issues with ties to systemic racism, such as Native American land rights, voter reform, immigration, the criminal justice system, a number of different things. Then participants who were in the experimental condition were assigned to read an article about a historical event or events that have implications for one of those policies. And then they also have a partner in the study who completes the same measures and reads a complementary article. And I'm going to say a little bit more about this in just a moment. But they read a complementary article on a related topic. We do have a control condition in this study, and those participants read articles that didn't have anything to do with race. So they read about, for example, endangered species. So then after reading those articles, the participants get together as partners, and they go through a series of discussion prompts to sort of talk about their articles and draw connections. And then after that, they go back into their own private breakout rooms. This was done over Zoom. And they fill out the post-test measures. So they sort of respond to the same policy and racism measures that they answered at the beginning. So now to tell you just a little bit more about those discussion prompts. So these were designed to help participants recognize the systemic nature of racism by drawing connections between different historical events. So an example of this is that one person would read an article about the origins of the police force being born out of Southern slave patrols, and another person would read about the loophole in the 13th Amendment that allowed slavery for those who were convicted of crimes and convict leasing programs. So they're both reading things that have implications for the criminal justice system, and they're asked to sort of discuss the connections between those historical things that they read about. Next, we gave them a prompt to sort of guide them to recognizing the harm that this systemic racism has caused, to help them connect historical racial injustices with other moral issues, to establish empathy with the victims and survivors of racial injustices. And then the final question, which I think is really critical here, is then recognizing connections with contemporary policies. So we really didn't want them to leave this conversation thinking about this being some sort of thing that happened in this disconnected, distant past era. We wanted them to be thinking about the way there is a through line that connects all the way to the present. So we're really trying to set them up to draw those connections within their conversation. Okay, so the hypothesis was that educating people about historical racial injustices would increase their recognition of connections with systemic racism. So for example, participants who read about historical racial injustices in the criminal justice system, like the example I just gave, would more strongly agree that the criminal justice system reinforces systemic racism at post-test. And what I'm showing you here is the change from pre-test to post-test, and the values being greater than 0 is showing us that they did change. So there was more recognition of racism at post-test than at pre-test. And actually, we even saw that in the control condition, but obviously more so in the experimental condition. I anticipated that education about historical racial injustices would also increase support for policy change. So for example, participants who read about historical racial injustices in the criminal justice system would be more likely to agree that the criminal justice system needs reform. And consistent with this hypothesis, we are again seeing a change from pre-test to post-test, wherein participants are more likely, especially in the experimental condition, to indicate that that policy needs reform at post-test. Okay. So one of the cool things about this project is that we can also examine whether learning about historical racial injustices in one area, such as the criminal justice system, only impact connections with systemic racism and policy positions on that specific topic, or whether it also helps increase awareness of racism and shapes policy positions more broadly. So for instance, does reading about historical racial injustices related to criminal justice only influence attitudes toward the focal policy of criminal justice reform, or does it also influence attitudes toward other policies such as voter reform or reparations? Excuse me. And what I'm showing you here is that we did see some evidence of it bleeding on to influence attitudes toward other policies. So not just the focal policy, we're also seeing increased support for policy reform related to other policies. Okay, wrapping this up. So lastly, I just wanted to show that we have been looking at this over time. We have got 1 month and 9 month follow-ups. Okay. We're not completely done with data collection. So this is sort of tentative initial results. We're still collecting 9 month data, but I wanted to show you there's some evidence that it's continuing over time. And if we look at the data for white participants only, who are particularly likely to be unaware of this critical history, then we see that that is particularly the case, that it's persisting over time. Okay, so finally, returning to my metaphor of the sea, the work that I've highlighted for you here today demonstrates how our social attitudes and beliefs are shaped by often overlooked features of our social environments, such as nonverbal cues and microaggressions, and how these patterns of thought and behavior go on to perpetuate and reinforce systems of oppression. And then in some of the most recent work that I showed you, I'm examining how some of these patterns can be interrupted to increase awareness of the system and alter the attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors that perpetuate systemic oppression. All right, and that is the end. I just wanted to thank the funders of the research that I told you about, and also, most importantly, my research lab, the GABA Lab, without whom this work would definitely not be possible.